Good morning, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, depending on where you are. Welcome to our webinar. This is the second of a series consisting of sharing the content and recommendation that come out of the Natural Capital for African Development Finance. And this second webinar is entitled Natural Capital Tools and Approaches for Evaluating Investment Projects in Africa. And today we discuss the economic valuation of natural capital for investment decision-making and the natural capital assessment for development corridor projects. And we will see some example. I will now give you our webinar housekeeping rule. Next slide, please. The next slide again. Yes. So the duration of our webinar is 19 minutes, including question and answer. And for all your microphone will be disabled for the duration of the webinar. And question can be submitted via Q&A, the Q&A slot, or by raising your hand, and we will give you the floor. And the webinar will be conducted in English. And within the 72 hours following the webinar, you will receive the slide, the presentation, and also the recording of the session. And they will also be available on the Making Finance Work for Africa website. And if you encounter any technical problem, please send a message to the organizer. And finally, do not forget to complete the questionnaire, which will automatically appear on your browser at the end of the webinar. So I wish you a good session, and I will now give the floor to Samantha Meyers. Samantha, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Arnold. Hello, bienvenue, Manawana. So good to have you all here with us today. Thank you all for being here. I'm looking forward to these presentations as much as you are. And I'm thrilled to introduce the presenters you'll be hearing from today. I'll start with myself and we'll go through the other three presenters. I'll give you a brief overview of the agenda and then we'll get started. So why are you hearing from me? I'm Samantha Meyers. I lead Global Communications for Conservation Strategy Fund, CSF. CSF is a partner organization of the Natural Capital for African Development Finance Initiative. We are a small but mighty conservation organization using economic and finance tools to benefit people and nature. For almost 30 years, our research and training program has helped reveal the true trade-offs of development, demonstrate the inherent values of nature, and generate financially viable, sustainable, and equitable environmental solutions. One of our first presenters today will be Wadzenai Mafunga. She is an environmental economist at Conservation Strategy Fund on our Africa team. Based in South Africa, Wadzenai has extensive experience in bridging the gap between economic development and environmental sustainability, and has applied economic principles to address industry issues and challenges, including those within the South African sugar industry. She has lectured on environmental sustainability at the Durban University of Technology, which ignited a passion to pursue a career in conservation economics, which we are very grateful for. Our next presenter will be Nuruddin Jahar. He is an environmental economist at CSF based in Ethiopia. His research primarily focuses on environmental valuation, which we'll be hearing about more today, and the impact of energy use on forest conservation. He will be speaking to you all today about an environmental valuation project that he led at CSF, which estimated the annual economic contributions of the Kibango-Okavango River Basin. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Kiraben Naikar, who is a senior program officer on the Nature Economy team at the UN Environment Program World Conservation Monitoring Center. In this role, he leads initiatives that bridge environmental sustainability with economic and financial decision-making. By collaborating closely with economists and specialist scientists, his leadership in science policy helps to shape innovative, practical, and context-specific solutions. Brief overview of the plan today. We'll first hear from CSF economists Wadzenai and Nuruddin. Wadzenai will be presenting on an overview of the link between natural capital accounting and environmental valuation. Nuruddin will jump in with a case study from the Kibango-Okavango River Basin. Then Kirabin will present on natural capital assessment strategies for development projects. That will include a case study on the Pemba-Lichinga Integrated Development Corridor project in Mozambique. So throughout all the presentations, as Arnold was saying, please use the Q&A function to add questions throughout. We will have plenty of time in the second half of the webinar to answer your questions and have discussions about these topics. And if you have any questions, please reach out to the organizer through the chat too, if it's unrelated to the material of the presentations. Okay, great. So now you'll be hearing from two of CSF's Africa-based environmental economists on some of the ways that we can harness economic tools of environmental valuation to support conservation in Africa. Wadsanai Mafunga, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sam. That was a great introduction. It's such a pleasure to be part of this important conversation. And as you can see on the screen, the title of my presentation is Economic Valuation of Natural Capital for Investment Decision Making. Next slide, please, Sam. So my presentation will have that outline. First, I'll start by differentiating between natural capital accounting and economic valuation. Then I'll proceed to explain the linkage between those two and explain why we do valuation studies. There are quite a number of reasons, and I'll unpack that in this presentation. Then I'll also give an overview of the different methods of valuation, as well as key considerations for valuation. And then my colleague will take over and give an example of a case study of an economic valuation that we did for the Kavango River Basin. Next slide, please, Sam. So when we talk about natural capital, we know it's the world's stock of resources, and it is from these stocks that humans derive their benefits. And we need to understand that natural capital accounting does not involve placing a value on nature. Instead, it's about tracking changes in assets, their condition, and the flow of services to economic activities. Valuation is what actually places a value on environmental goods and services. So with valuation, we know that it can be difficult, if not impossible, but us not doing so leaves us valuing all the environmental resources at $0, which is something that does not lead to the best policy decisions. Next slide, please. So why do we account for natural capital? There was a study by Managi and Kuma in 2018, where they tracked the accounting values of produced capital, human capital, and natural capital. And you can see that over the years in that observed period, there was such an increase in produced capital, while natural capital has decreased drastically, and this is a cause for concern. Next slide, please, Sam. So in this slide, this is an overview of the link between a natural capital asset and how it gets to be valued. So first, for example, if we have a woodland will provide different ecosystem services, provisioning services, the timber, regulatory services, supporting services, and cultural services. And humans benefit from these ecosystem services. They get timber, and it can be an attractive environment, facilitating exercise and so forth. And then when we do valuation, we value those benefits. So it can be the sale of food products or money that can be saved in cases where there could have been flooding if that woodland didn't exist. So this is just a flow diagram showing how everything relates. Next slide, please, Sam. Why do we carry out valuation studies? So the first thing, we do that so that we can evaluate project options. And when we do this, we are answering the questions such as, what's the most cost-effective way to protect the shoreline? Should we support this project or policy or intervention? We also do it to inform spatial planning processes. where we get to investigate what the opportunity cost of development is, or conservation in a certain area. And then we also use it to set prices and create incentives for conservation finance programs. So we are asking the question, what should payment be in a government incentive program for watershed protection maybe, or carbon sequestration? After doing evaluation, the results of that study can inform such decisions. And then we also use it for estimating the needed mitigation and compensation. So suppose there's been some environmental damage or loss that has happened. Through valuation, we can be able to estimate how much compensation may be needed, because sometimes we can compensate a low value compared to what actually the damage was. And then we can use it in natural resource accounting, which is something I alluded to earlier on. So to support the documentation of flow of changes in a nation's natural resources, if we do valuation, we can then track by also giving values to that natural resource accounting. Then it helps with environmental education. So with valuation, the results, they can change attitudes, increase awareness of the importance of the environment. We need to understand that without environmental valuation, ecosystems are often undervalued. They can be overexploited or ignored in policy decisions. So by quantifying their benefits, we make their contribution visible and ensure that they're factored into economic and development planning. Next slide, please, Sam. Okay, so this slide, I hope I'm not overwhelming you with this slide. I'm going to try and break it down in a very simple way. It's an overview of the different valuation methods that we use. I'm going to specifically focus on a few that we use more often, and the methods are broadly categorized into 4. So we have the production function, we also have market-based methods, and then those which we use the method of asking people questions directly. And then the last one can be what we call a benefit transfer. So with the production function, here we are explaining how a change in the ecosystem results in a change in production and services to people. So using my forest example, the woodland example. So we know that a forest helps to regulate water flow, it reduces soil erosion, and this improves water quality for downstream farmers, maybe leading to higher crop yields. So we can calculate the value of a woodland by estimating or measuring how much additional agricultural output is generated due to the forest's water filtration benefits. And then when we look at the market-based methods, we have the market prices. Here we are looking at actual market prices of goods and services provided by the ecosystem. And an example using the woodland is that if a forest produces timber, firewood, or other non-timber forest products like mushrooms and medicinal plants, we can get the value by looking at the market price of those products. And then we can use cost-based methods under the market-based methods again. And with cost-based methods, we are estimating the cost of replacing an ecosystem service, or the avoided costs if that ecosystem service continues to be in existence. So for example, with the replacement costs, we are estimating the cost of replacing an ecosystem service with human-made alternatives. So for a woodland, if a forest filters and purifies water, the value of this service can be estimated by calculating the cost of building a example. We also have damage costs avoided. So if a forest prevents soil erosion and landslides, the value of the service can be measured by estimating the cost of repairing roads or farmland if the forest were removed. And then lastly, under this category, we've got revealed preferences, where we have travel costs and hedonic prices. with travel costs, we are estimating the economic value of an ecosystem based on how much people spend to visit. So if tourists visit a forest for hiking, bird watching, we can use their travel expenses to estimate the recreational value of that woodland. And with hedonic pricing, it's measuring how proximity to an environmental feature affects property prices. So houses near a protected forest or woodland may be more expensive, obviously due to cleaner air, scenic beauty, and recreational benefits. And with stated preferences, which is the third category, we are asking people directly. We cannot observe their choices, so we ask, maybe using the contingent valuation method, where we are giving people a scenario. Would they be willing to pay, for example, for a protected area or for park pricing? So with the woodland example, we are saying a government may survey local communities to find out how much they'll be willing to pay to protect a woodland from deforestation or to fund reforestation efforts. And then the last one, which is one that takes less of effort, is the benefit transfer. So this one we need to be very careful about, because it's about using studies that's been done in that have been done in other areas, and then applying the results to a similar area. So the reliability of this method, it depends on the similarity between the two areas. For example, their physical characteristics have to be more or less similar. The ecological characteristics like vegetation types, the species, have to be more or less similar. So I've just touched on some of them. There are quite a number, but I hope this has just helped you to understand the methods that we use for valuation. Next slide, please, Sam. So the key considerations are when we are doing an economic valuation is that ecosystem services are spatial. So what we mean is that their availability, distribution, and benefits, they vary across different locations, and we need to take cognizance of that when we're carrying out evaluation. And we need to also understand that large changes may not be linear, and marginal changes are important. So if the value of 1 kilometer loss of mangrove is $1,000, it doesn't mean that if we lose 60 kilometers of mangroves, it's going to be $60,000. So we need to, that's where it becomes a bit tricky, but we need to bear that in mind. And also, the willingness to pay is determined by the ability to pay, and this has significant distributional implications. So people in different areas, depending on their income and their affordability, they may value a certain ecosystem service differently, depending on, like I've said, how much they get. So we need to also bear that in mind. And then lastly, price does not equal value. So just because something has no price, it does not mean that that particular thing is not valuable. So if a wetland has no assigned value, we can drain it and build houses on it. But in reality, a wetland prevents flooding, it purifies water, it supports fisheries, and without valuation, these services may not be considered. So now, I am handing over to my colleague, Nuruddin, who will present an application of the environmental valuation framework in a case study on the Okavango River Basin. Over to you, Nuruddin.
Think we may have lost Nuruddin to the Wi-Fi universe. So I can just go through, I'll just go through a few of these on his behalf while we wait for him to join us back again. Okay, so this is a very important study that we conducted, that CSF conducted in Africa, and it covered 3 different country territories, and we'll just go into some key highlights about it, and then I can answer more specific questions in the Q&A. So very quickly, next slide, please, Matsaliso. Thank you. So why did we carry out this study? There were quite a few reasons that this study specifically was strategically significant. First of all, this ecosystem, the Cubango-Cubango River Basin, is home to about 1 million people, likely more. That's just a rough estimate. So it hosts a lot of local communities. A lot of people depend on it for their livelihoods. It transports about 9.5 million cubic meters of water that's carried through the rivers in Angola down into Botswana, Namibia. It's a very, very important water source for all the people and animals in the region. The part of the ecosystem that is within the country of Botswana is a key biodiversity area, so it's very, very important for tourism revenue and local economies. We also conducted the study to really understand some of the economic value of this ecosystem, how it's contributing to the economies of all 3 countries, so that policymakers, decision makers can integrate this important value into their decisions about how they manage the land. And it will really help, especially to better assess the cost of losing some of this valuable nature and the benefits. Really, it will help us really communicate the benefits of keeping this nature together and restoring parts of it as well. So this is part of, one of CSF's goals of making the economic case for conservation, justifying investment in conservation by using the proof of a really large economic value for these ecosystems. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so this is the scope of the study. It was a limited study area. The whole ecosystem is quite large. We also only chose about 8 ecosystem services to value during this process. But as you can see, the entire river basin engulfs a huge part of Angola, a very important part of Namibia, has access to the river and the water, and then down into Botswana, where you have the delta and the key biodiversity area. So it's a very important transboundary ecosystem. And the total area of this study that we conducted was 226,000 kilometers squared. So we studied a huge portion of this ecosystem, but we couldn't possibly study the whole ecosystem. Next slide, please. Okay, so here are some of the results. Our total value for all of the 8 ecosystem services that we studied ended up being, in US dollars, about 1.1 billion in economic contributions annually by this study area to the countries of Angola, Botswana, and Namibia. And you can see in the graph that we've highlighted some of the most important or really interesting takeaways from our studies. So you can see for Angola, the ecosystem service of crop provisioning, so access to crops and agriculture, was a huge component of the economic value that this ecosystem provides. Similarly, you can see in Namibia, I was speaking about the river portion that crosses through Namibia. It provides really valuable wild fish provisioning services. That's the highlighted in orange. And then Botswana, because of that key biodiversity area, it was natural that there would be just so much economic value drawn to Botswana through this ecosystem. So you can see under Botswana, the recreation-related services, so that's tourism, bird watching, traveling through the nature of Botswana, that accounted for $200 million US annually in economic value. Next slide, please. Okay, so as you can see, this is a pie chart of just the amount of economic value per country. So total was 1.1 billion estimated, and that's for only those 8 ecosystem services. So it's likely if you included more additional ecosystem services, that value would go up. So 70% of that value is provided to Angola. 23.4% is for Botswana, and about 6% was Namibia. And that, of course, makes sense if you look back to the scope of the study and sort of the areas of each of the countries that we included in our research. So it was only a very little part of Namibia, but still very, very valuable. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, very quickly, there are a ton of key insights from this study, and we would be happy to share with you our policy briefs and the study itself if there are any questions. One of the big things we noticed was there is a huge amount of there's a real gap of data in this area for natural capital assessment, and so we had to work with a lot of spatial data, and we had to make a lot of assumptions. So it's really, really important that as a community we build more data up about the nature in this ecosystem. We also recommend that people in the region think about alternative livelihoods and sustainable utilization of their natural resources. They make sure that the supply that they get of natural resources is sustainable moving forward. And in the short term and long term, we recommended that policymakers support OCACOM decision support system, which is a collaboration between all three countries to manage this ecosystem, because it is a transboundary resource. It crosses borders. It's something that really needs long-term sustainable policies that can be applied to multiple communities, many different areas of the ecosystem, and it has to be a collaborative approach. It's very, very important for a landscape as large as this one and as valuable. So thank you so much for listening to us talk about this case study. And please add any questions you have into the Q&A, whether specific or otherwise, and we can share more resources about this case study with you in the future. I will now pass the floor over to Kirben, who will be talking to us. We'll head south to Mozambique, and we'll hear about some natural capital assessment strategies for development projects. After Kirben's presentation, we will have time to address your questions. So please continue to add them into the Q&A slot, and let us know if you have any thoughts about what you've been hearing. Thank you so much. Go ahead, Kirben.
Thank you very much, Sam. And yes, it's my pleasure to present the summary of key findings on the policy briefs that were actually developed under the African Development Finance Program Initiative. So yeah, I will go on to my slides. Can you see my slides? Hopefully. Okay. So my presentation will cover briefly the key findings and key highlights of the policy briefs that I mentioned that were actually developed under the Natural Capital for Africa Development Finance Program. And I'll clarify some conceptual understandings of the concepts that were used in the policy briefs. And then I'll present very briefly some of the case studies and go into more detail on the Mozambique Pemba Lechinga case study. So yeah, next slide. Okay, so we've heard from Wadziana that the importance of natural capital, and in Africa, Africa holds 30 to 50% of global natural capital. This natural capital includes biodiversity, mineral resources, wildlife, and ecosystems as well. And the natural capital is crucial for agriculture, soil, pollination, water regulation, energy, for example, hydropower. However, economic stability is often threatened in Africa by resource depletion. And there are many, many initiatives, but one flagship initiative is the Natural Capital for African Development Finance, which provides insights on natural capital tools and approaches to evaluate and enhance investment projects in Africa. The NC4-ADF supports sustainable finance through natural capital approaches, and in partnership with the African Development Bank, the Green Growth Knowledge Platform, WWF, and UNEP WCMC, we developed these policy briefs following a Green Economy Summit. And these, very specifically, these policy briefs, I don't know whether you can read them, but yeah.
Sorry.
The first one, sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. We're seeing the presenter view of your slides. Is there a way to make it full screen?
Oh. Presenter view.
I think swap presenter view and slideshow, maybe the top one.
That one. Yeah.
Would that work?
Is that better?
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you so much.
All right, great. Yeah, sure. Yes, where was I? Okay, so I'm presenting the actual policy briefs. The first one is activating the green recovery action plans in Africa through nature-based solutions and natural capital approaches. The second one is on financing green recovery using natural capital approaches across Africa. And then there's the technical note, which I will cover in my next presentation or the follow-up to this one, through the case study in Mozambique, which is a technical note on the practical applications of natural capital. So some of the entry points that have allowed for this work to unfold is the strategic alignment, particularly at the global level. Obviously, it's the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals up to 2030. It's the Paris Agreement that was endorsed in 2015, and the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures in 2021. And at the regional level, it is the African Union Green Recovery Plan, which runs from 2021 to 2027. There's other initiatives like the AFRI 100, which was launched in 2015. There's the Great Green Wall that was launched in 2007. And at the organizational level, there is the African Development Bank Natural Resources Strategy, which I think I mentioned earlier, and this runs from 2023 to 2027. There's also many other natural capital accounting frameworks in the process at an organizational level, at a global level, and even at a regional level as well. Next slide. So as I mentioned, some of these policy briefs use concepts like nature-based solutions and natural capital, and we heard a lot about what natural capital is. But this is a widely adopted definition of nature-based solutions. This is by the United Nations Environment Assembly. Actions to protect, conserve, restore, sustainably use, and manage natural or modified terrestrial, freshwater, coastal, and marine ecosystems. And of course, natural capital, on the other hand, is referred to as the stocks of natural assets. But natural capital approaches are more analytical and valuation-oriented, helping to integrate the value of nature into policy and economic frameworks, while nature-based solutions, NBS, are more practical implementation of actual projects or interventions, leveraging ecosystems to provide these measurable benefits. So why natural capital matters for finance institutions? For sustainability, it ensures long-term viability of ecosystems, supporting economies. In terms of risk mitigation, reduces project failures linked to ecosystem degradation. In Africa, protecting mitigation, drought impacts, issues in sub-Saharan Africa related to irrigation projects. In terms of opportunities, significant returns and co-benefits from nature-based solutions, transitioning to nature-based infrastructure and built environments, including using nature-based solutions rather than gray infrastructure, may generate more than 3 trillion in business opportunities and over 100 million jobs by 2030. This is by the World Economic Forum. There are other reports that investments in landscape restoration creates twice as many jobs as the oil and gas sector as well. So there's lots of opportunities for natural capital, nature-based solutions, and natural capital approaches. There's also alignment supporting the SDGs, 13 on climate, 15 on life above our terrestrial land. Then there's the African Union Agenda, the 2063 Agenda, and the African Union Green Recovery Plan. So some of the tools and methodologies that are available for natural capital assessments include the INVEST model, the ARIES model, which quantifies ecosystem services. It allows for data integration, combining spatial, ecological, and economic databases. It provides for scenario analysis, evaluating business as usual versus nature positive development outcomes. And we'll see in the Mozambique case study how these two scenarios pan out. Co-benefits, the tools highlight economic, environmental, and social benefits. As I mentioned, job creation. There are other tools, principles for responsible banking, which provide target setting for banks, and the recently adopted Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework Resource Mobilization Strategy for biodiversity, which runs from 2025 to 2030. So I'm going to touch very briefly on the case study on Lukanga Swamp in Zambia. This is a critical ecosystem which stabilizes water flow, essential for agriculture and energy. And the natural capital assessment, the loss of the swamp's capacity cost $24 million annually. So again, the outcomes of a natural capital assessment, it demonstrates the value of protecting these ecosystems in development planning. These development finance institutions are therefore catalysts for sustainable finance, leading efforts to shift investment towards nature-positive policies. For example, the Sustainable Blue Economy finance principles. There's the Climate Finance Facility of the Development Bank of Southern Africa, the DBSA, which supports low-carbon infrastructure projects. They also launched a green bank model in 2019. This green bank model showcases a scalable model for middle and low-income countries to meet commitments under the SDGs, the Paris Agreement, and the nationally determined contributions. The African Development Bank's strategic shift through the strategy that I mentioned earlier is the Natural Resources Management and Investment Strategy, which runs from 2023 to 2027. There's the other case study in South Africa with the objective of removing invasive species to enhance water availability and ecosystem health. This boosted stream flow by 46 million cubic meters per year and creating 50,000 jobs annually. Insights highlight the potential for aligning projects with nature-based solutions, principles, and natural capital approaches. Again, the Working for Water program of work is recognized as one of the most successful integrated land management programs in the world. There's also the Cape Town Water Fund, restoring watersheds to enhance water supply and security. So some of the key insights on natural capital approaches and nature-based solutions. Natural capital approaches provide economic justification for investing in nature, guiding better decision-making. The NBS offers practical, sustainable, and cost-effective responses to societal challenges through job creation and economic recovery. Improved ecosystem resilience, example, increased water availability, climate regulation, potential for attracting diversified finance sources through public-private partnerships and blended finance, engagement of stakeholders, including the private sector, the public sector, and society with a view to mobilizing finance from the private sector, data sharing agreements, and then also encouraging and fostering community stewardship. And as you've seen, many of these case studies illustrate the tangible financial returns, resilience benefits, and scalability. And of course, good governance is critically important, driving green recovery through this whole process. The evolving role and strategic opportunities for development finance institutions. They play a catalytic role in mainstreaming natural capital into investment frameworks through strengthening national capacity for natural capital accounting and data systems at the national level, expanding collaboration across the DFIs, private, government, leveraging resources for sustainable projects, building a pipeline of bankable and scalable NBS projects with quantified co-benefits and innovative finance models. And some of the future initiatives, the African Development Bank, for example, will partner on the GF8 Net Zero Nature Positive project with a focus on supporting African countries in achieving net zero nature positive outcomes. And as I mentioned, the recently adopted KMG GBF resource mobilization strategy for biodiversity is an opportunity which runs from 2025 to 2030. So the call to action, DFIs and financial institutions should embed natural capital and NBS into their strategic decisions to achieve resilient, sustainable, and inclusive growth across Africa, actively integrate natural capital considerations into financial risk assessments and investment decisions, champion and facilitate the uptake and scaling of nature-based solutions for sustainable economic recovery, and commit to collaboration to unlock the full potential of Africa's natural capital. That comes to the end of my overview of the policy briefs itself. And now I'll go into the case study of the Mozambique Pemba Lichinga Special Agro-Industrial Processing Zone, SAPS, where a natural capital approach was used in this case study. So why use a natural capital approach? And I think we've heard a lot about why using a natural capital approach, but the important thing is that this case study examines how Mozambique's Special Agro-Industrial Processing Zone incorporated a natural capital approach. And the entry point, importantly, was the Interministerial Steering Group for Mozambique's Green Economy Action Plan, the GEP, which identified mapping, valuation, and integration of natural capital in national planning. And this was a top priority. So in response to this entry point and this priority by government, the Natural Capital for African Development Finance Initiative commissioned a natural capital assessment of the SAPs. So just a little bit of a background to this and context of Mozambique. Agriculture contributes 26% of the GDP, employing 71% of the workforce. However, agricultural productivity in Mozambique is the lowest in the region. And as such, the Pemba Lichinga SAPS project came about, which aimed to boost agricultural productivity and create sustainable agribusiness value chains. The SAPS was therefore an opportunity to enhance water resources, soil quality, and carbon sequestration, improving the agricultural productivity in the northern Mozambique, and there's the map on your left, bringing together smallholders out of subsistence farming and into a competitive and inclusive agribusiness sector. So there were two forward-looking scenarios. As I mentioned earlier, business as usual, which focused on maximizing crop yield within the cropland boundaries. And then there was the natural capital approach, which combines crop production with targeted agroforestry and afforestation to improve ecosystem services. The targeted agroforestry areas were important areas for water and soil retention. The assessment modeled ecosystem service flows to compare these two approaches, the business as usual and the natural capital approach. So just a little bit more about this natural capital approach. The extent of existing cropland targeted for the agroforestry was just more than 4,460 hectares. And for afforestation of existing riparian cropland was just about 10,513 hectares. The map on your right, it just demonstrates this targeted area, the proposed agroforestry and afforestation in the Muanda Basin under the natural capital approach scenario. And the ecosystem services assessed included water flow regulation for the dry season supply, sediment retention for erosion control services for water courses and irrigation protection, carbon sequestration and storage for climate change mitigation, and wood fueling provisioning services for local energy security. The table at the bottom on your left is just the economic benefits, and I will explain a little bit more about this in my next slide. But the key findings from this natural capital assessment show that water flow regulation increased during the dry season water supply by 2.85 million cubic meters. Sediment retention reduced river sedimentation by 21.655 cubic meters per year. For carbon sequestration, there was 16,720 tons of CO2 equivalent per year in additional carbon storage. And in terms of fuel wood supply, this increased by 12,487 tons annually, improving the local energy security. So in terms of the economic benefits of the natural capital approach, the increased ecosystem services were valued at 626,000 million. $305 US per year. and this is equivalent that accrue to benefits, 42 US dollars benefits that accrue to Mozambique from the afforestry and afforestation interventions. This increases to 90 US dollars per hectare when globally, which includes the avoided social costs of climate change mitigation instead of using traded carbon prices, for example. The natural capital assessments therefore supported integrated landscape development, informing nature-based solutions to support the SAPs, supporting irrigation potential, delivering the wider social benefits, improving energy security in the Muanda River Basin, delivering climate change mitigation, supporting nationally determined contributions, and delivering better biodiversity outcomes. 10,000 hectares of natural forest with benefits for forest biodiversity. So at the local level, the African Development Bank, local impact, this natural capital approach enhances the energy security and biodiversity. It supported Mozambique's Green Economy Action Plan, the GEP, as I mentioned. It built technical and institutional capacity for investment decision-making and project appraisal. It encourages climate and conservation co-financing. And some of the broad recommendations coming out of all these policy briefs and the technical note and as well as the case studies as well mentioned, these natural capital approaches can enhance agricultural and economic development while protecting ecosystems. Policymakers and financial institutions should integrate ecosystem service valuations into investment planning, leveraging co-financing opportunities, climate and conservation funds. This can drive sustainability through focused investments. And you know, a lot of the times the biggest constraint is data and information about ecosystems. But continued research and data collection on ecosystem services will obviously improve future natural capital assessments and improve decision-making and policy development accordingly. I think that's my story today. So thank you so much. Yeah, thank you. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Kirvan. Those were fantastic presentations and case studies. Really, really good examples of applications of this framework. We had a ton of questions come in for you, so we will start with some questions for you specifically about your presentations, and then we'll address some questions for the rest of our speakers. All right, so if we're ready, first question came in from Aaron for you, Kirvan, asking, can natural capital be leveraged by African governments to obtain climate finance from international funders? And if so, what would be some of the requirements that the governments would need to meet?
So yes, of course, there are definitely synergies between, you know, the biodiversity sector and the climate. And there's initiatives around natural capital accounting, supporting and natural capital approaches, supporting the implementation of the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plans, which are driven by governments for implementation. And again, there are synergies with the nationally determined contributions as well in terms of implementation and meeting those the Paris agreements. So definitely, these are some of the synergies between different strategies that need to be implemented by government. And government can actually look at the co-benefits between climate and biodiversity. And more, the climate agenda is advancing to such an extent that it would be a misfortune for biodiversity if we didn't explore those co-benefits for biodiversity finance as well. So yeah, I think governments are more and more looking at an integrated agenda, a natural capital agenda, climate interventions. We've done some work in the Congo region as well, integrated planning, combining both biodiversity and climate as well. I hope that answers that question.
That was great. And sort of following along with that response, are there, it needs to be a collaborative approach. So what are some strategic opportunities for development financed institutions, right, to get involved in this and work directly with governments?
So I think, as I mentioned in my presentation, there's many opportunities for this whole natural capital agenda to bring together all these different crises of the planet, and I think that's where we need to push for a more integrated approach rather than the silo approach. So that's where finance for nature, finance for climate is going anyway, in terms of a limited and resource constrained world as well. It just makes sense to actually combine all the different crises, whether it's pollution, it's climate change, and biodiversity loss as well. And I think there's many entry points in government, national planning processes that development finance institutions can support in terms of infrastructure development and climate and nature interventions as well. Yep.
That's great. That's great. Okay, we have some questions coming in about your Mozambique case study. One from Johannes. Based on your key findings in Mozambique, how can large-scale infrastructure and agricultural projects ensure that they do not negatively impact natural capital? It's kind of a big one.
Yes, no, it is a big one. It is a big one, and I think jointly together with this, for example, in this particular case study, it was a intensification of infrastructure development in this corridor. And so jointly we did this natural capital assessment to actually inform decision making along the journey of infrastructure development, because a lot of the developing countries, their priority is to develop and to enhance infrastructure development for better well-being. But I think the natural capital approach shows that in order to conserving and protecting your ecological infrastructure, your nature systems, and biodiversity is actually enhancing your livelihoods together with built infrastructure. So it's a parallel process, I think, and together that we need to pursue natural capital assessments that inform the decision making for infrastructure development and development broadly as well.
Yeah, so you want to be conducting the assessment in parallel so you can refer back to the data.
Yes.
Development decisions are being made. And
yes.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you. Okay, we've got a question about data sourcing. Hannah's asking about your Mozambique case study. So for the natural capital assessment, where do you get all of your data from? And she specifically asked, do you collaborate with citizen science initiatives?
So yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the data, and specifically for this Mozambique study, came from the government itself, but then also there are private sources as well, and there's global data sets which are limiting in some way, and where there were actual gaps. But there are some initial biodiversity assessments that were undertaken, and we used a lot of those data sources to actually put together the assessments. But yeah, data is a big problem. There's many initiatives to look at. We are busy at UNEP WCMC looking at how data flows from the private sector into public sector decision making and natural capital accounting. So again, we're looking at those those sources of data. Then looking at how public sector data also flows in the other way to inform decision making and policy development in the private sector, and informing regulatory reform as well. So yeah, data, as I said, is always a challenge. But I think we've got to start somewhere with respect to yeah, natural capital assessments. And as we get more and more information from infrastructure development projects, strategic environmental assessments, impact evaluation studies, and specialist studies that are conducted for infrastructure development, the data actually improves information on the ground in terms of verifying the public sector data sources as well. So yeah, I don't have all the answers, and we have many challenges with respect to data, but yeah, that's where we are at the moment.
Definitely. We could always use more data in this field, certainly.
Yeah.
Hey, I'm going to welcome Wadsanai and Nuruddin to join us. And I would like to actually, on the data topic, ask Nuruddin to answer one of our questions about the CORB study. What was the criteria for selecting the 8 ecosystem services that we selected for that study on the Cubango-Okavango River Basin? Because I know that was data access related as well.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, thank you. The criteria for selecting the types of ecosystem services, we use literatures mainly, the previous studies in the area, and we identify different types of ecosystem services that provided by the basin to the beneficiary. So it's mainly from different literatures and from the stakeholders in the surrounding. What are the types of ecosystem services? What are the benefits that people in the surrounding? Because in the SIA framework, there are a lot of types of ecosystem services mentioned, and a given nature might not give all the types of ecosystem services. So what we do is we just go through desktop review literatures, and then we identify the most important and the most relevant types of ecosystem services in the surrounding. So it's mainly from the literatures and from the SIA framework also. I think this might help you.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Nuruddin. All right, Wadsanai, I'm bringing you in. We have a lot of questions coming up generally about environmental valuation, and quite a few coming in about how price doesn't equate to value. So can you speak more to us a little bit about how with environmental evaluation estimates, the value of the environment without them ends up being $0, but with them, we can sort of get closer to a more accurate understanding of the value that nature provides. And then a follow-up, our question from Philip was, how best can we promote value for ecosystem services when prices are wrongly assigned?
Okay. Thank you, Sam. So the issue with the idea that price is not necessarily equal to value, it's, value is often assigned based on market transactions. So what are people willing to pay for goods and services? So what then that means is that for most environmental benefits or ecosystem services, they're not traded in the market, and therefore they lack a direct price. So without an explicit valuation that quantifies the economic value, it then means when there's production taking place, the intrinsic value of nature is not catered for. So it leads to their neglect in decision making. So that's how that works out. So with valuation, it then makes it a lot easier for even that to be clear. What is the value, the true value of nature? Because if we don't include that, then that is ignored. I don't know if that answers the question, Sam.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, a question now for all of our panelists. Anyone can jump in. How can economic valuation of natural capital help reduce financial risks in large-scale investments? I guess, can it help reduce financial risks? And if so, in what way? Festus, you've stumped us all with that question. Any answers?
Okay, I'll give it a try.
Give it a try.
Yeah, no, I think it's all about providing as much information as possible on the trade-offs. So in terms of the various potential projects that are underway, weighing what is the potential of one development versus another, and your natural capital assessments actually inform the decision-making process. And I relate to an example in the Congo region where we are looking at integrated planning at the local level, and there's competing land uses as well at a very local level. And so we look at the various information in terms of what would what would be a better economic make economic sense to the integrated planning of the particular region. So I would say that natural capital accounting definitely can support risk aversion and in terms of financing for future projects and development. It's an ongoing process, and it demonstrates it all depends on the policy questions that you're asking as well at the very outset of an assessment. And then you go through the assessment, and then you are provided with the findings. So it definitely can reduce your risk to a large extent.
Yeah, thank you. That was a brilliant response. And it's also a little bit about sort of communicating that risk to nature is financial risk, right? Your longer term projects, if they're not accounting for this data, then they're missing a whole portion of information in their decision making and how they sustain those projects moving forward. Thank you. That was a tough question. Great work. Okay, so we have this interesting question. This is again for all of you, so anyone jump in. Should a standardized coefficient or methodology be developed to enable meaningful comparisons across ecosystems despite differences in sizes, spatial distribution of services, and price variations?
That's really an interesting question, Sam. However, there's a reason why we have the different valuation methods, because the context is always different, and I believe it's best to apply a specific valuation method depending on the question you're trying to answer and the context in which you are in. So I would think that it may be a great idea to have that liberty to choose what works depending on the context or what research question you're trying to answer. But then, yeah, I don't know my colleagues if they feel the same way.
Yeah, maybe if I can add some few points. Yeah, regarding the valuation or the size of the areas also and the types of the ecosystem services might determine the methods that we are going to use for the valuation. For example, in the Okavango valuation, we have used a couple of methods. We didn't use only one method for all types of ecosystem services because based on the nature of the data and based on the nature of the type of ecosystem service, we use sometimes benefit transfer, for example, for fisheries, for wild fish provisioning, and we use the market value for crop provisioning and vegetation and I mean livestock provisioning also. So it's based on the nature of the data available and based on the type of the ecosystem service that we have to use the method of valuation. Hope this might also help or provide some information.
Thank you. Nurdan, while we have you, we're getting a lot of good questions about the CORB study. Can you talk a little bit more about what some of the key insights from that study were for Botswana, or policy decisions or recommendations?
Yeah, maybe for Botswana, when we were valuing the ecosystem services, it was tourism or the recreation related services were having the higher value because the Okavango Delta is one of the big sites for tourist destination and is contributing a lot to the national economy also. So our recommendation, our key insight for Botswana was regarding this type of, that is regarding this tourism. And the one challenge that we were facing in tourism for Botswana was the data gap. We were there was a limited data regarding the tourism. So we recommend, or the key insight for Botswana is regarding the data gap, addressing the data gap on tourism sector. But maybe for Angola, you didn't ask me, but the type of ecosystem service is different. So we just give some key insights, which is different from that of the Botswana. Thank you.
And just to follow up, thank you so much, Nurdan. Simon is asking, what were some of the valuation methods that you used in that study, in the CORB study?
Yeah, okay, is that for the Okavango? Yeah. For the crop provisioning, I think, yeah, we use market value. The market value was used, yeah. We are having data from the central statistics of the country. We get the current price of the given crops for different types of crops produced. And we do have the amount of crops produced also. So we just use the market value to evaluate the crop provisioning.
Great, thank you. And just because we're getting a lot of questions about this, in our Q&A, we will send the full CORB report and study to you all, so you can all have copies of that resource after this presentation. Don't worry. Okay, let's move to a question from Pierre for everyone. Could natural capital be used as collateral by African countries to increase green finance access? Any thoughts?
Please repeat the question, Sam.
Can natural capital be used as collateral by African countries to increase green finance access?
Maybe I worry, yeah, maybe I worry about the next generation. What will be the future of the next generation if we just give it as a collateral the nature to get some finance? That might not be good for the coming generations. That's my worry because uh, we are currently using, maybe we will use that finance these days, but nature is given as a collateral, so we may not protect and we may not conserve the natural resources, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. Any other thoughts?
Yes, I think from my side, I mean, the whole purpose of the natural capital approach, and there's a question around, what is a natural capital approach? And I think it comes back to trying to value a kind of asset, or value nature as an asset, so that it can be adequately considered in decision making regarding investment planning and the maintenance of nature as well. And it is not to value nature so that it can be sold or commodified. And I think that's the difference. And what we're finding more and more is that a lot of these approaches are actually questioned now, because it's bordering on selling off our nature for collateral, for whatever it is, and for profit. And it runs the risk of losing our biodiversity, ultimately. But I think the fraternity, came about with this concept to make nature, which was considered a free public good, to have some value, so that it can be integrated into economies. And I think that's what we need to push. And we need to push the idea that a lot of these approaches are increasing the evidence that nature is valuable, and rather than it is valued in a currency of some sorts, to improve decision making. Yeah. I hope that makes sense.
That definitely does. We also have a similar follow-up question that Natalie's asked, which you were beginning to answer already. But how does the concept of natural capital accounting differ from the more capitalism market-based model of adding a price tag to nature, versus conserving it?
So, I mean, natural capital accounting is different from capital valuation, and I think this is quite an interesting question, because it came up again more and more by many stakeholders. So again, it's how we pitch the case for natural capital accounting. And it's very, very important that we don't see it as a valuation tool, in terms of monetary valuation, even though it gives you some values with respect to your biodiversity, ecosystem services, etc. So more and more, we need to see natural capital accounting as a decision evidence-based decision support tool, rather than a valuation tool. And I think that's the difference, And as what Zane mentioned, that there are many other different valuation tools available. So I think we need to get the message clearly out there that natural capital accounting is not a valuation tool as such. Yeah.
Maybe if I'm just to add some points here also, yeah. The issue of the natural capital accounting is, I think it's not the value that we are trying to worry about. It's about the efficiency. For example, the economic growths are calculated ignoring the nature in the classical way of economic growth. They were ignoring the contribution of the nature and say that the value of the GDP or something is very high and we grow this much, but the contribution of nature was very low. So the main issue of valuation in the natural capital is, I think, to just see how much the nature is contributing to that economy and then bring back to conserve and provide the nature to the next generation also. So in order to just consider the next generations, we have to value it. Otherwise, it's not just as a normal market that the demand and the supply do. We cannot do it in the natural capital valuation.
Great, thank you. Thank you both. I'm curious to hear from you all as you look over this landscape. What do you see as some of the key barriers preventing businesses and governments from using the decision-making tool of natural capital assessments? Is it the perhaps confusion over how the data could be used, or how are you seeing your challenges in this field?
I think I can go first.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think while there is an appreciation that nature is valuable and it's important to integrate it in economic decisions, I also think there are just quite so many competing priorities, and it really becomes very challenging. You know, for example, let's say I talk about sustainable finance solutions. It can be quite difficult to get funding to support some good initiatives around protected areas and so forth, especially for Africa. But because there are these competing priorities, it becomes something that calls for our own innovativeness in maybe sourcing funds for such things. But also on the issue of integrating natural capital, I think it really also comes down to that there are competing priorities, which makes it quite difficult to balance the two, natural capital versus ensuring that there is employment and there is poverty alleviation and so forth. So that's also one thing, and it's also important to work together and not in silos, which is something that can help to give understanding of such things by raising awareness, especially awareness of economic, you know, how much it is valuable, and putting it out there, communicating the message about the trade-offs that come with building a bridge versus destroying a forest and so forth. So such things need to be taken into consideration as well.
Thank you so much, Ladznai. Okay, we're getting close to the end of our session, and so I wanted to just provide an opportunity for each of our presenters to share any final thoughts about the subject today, applications of natural capital or environmental valuations to help support conservation in Africa. Do any of you have any final words you want to say about the opportunities you're seeing in this space, any sort of next steps that this community can help with, and anything that you wanted to say within your presentations that you maybe didn't get a chance to. I want to open the floor to you all to share final thoughts with our audience.
I'll go first, Dr. Neg. Okay, so yeah, it's quite encouraging that there is interest around these issues, and that gives us hope that we are going somewhere. It's work in progress, which we will not get tired of working towards. And I think it's very important to continue building a community around sharing ideas of possible ways of integrating issues of the value of nature into our policy decisions and, economic development. It's not something that can be done by one person or one organization. There is need to collaborate, work together, and aim towards achieving our sustainability development goals. So that's about it. Thanks, Sam. And thank you for the opportunity to just present.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And yes, I'll just go next. I think natural capital is an opportunity. It's and accounting processes are being implemented in more than 90 countries. I think, and a lot of them are in Africa as well, which again, they are showing tremendous leadership in this area of work. So the Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework is a huge opportunity to actually align processes, as well as aligning processes with the climate agenda as well. So I think there's a huge opportunity here in a resource-constrained world, as I mentioned, to try and synergize these processes with all the different crises that the planet faces. And so I think, as you mentioned, Wadzani, is this community of practice that is key to share lessons, to share data across the continent as well. And I think we will go from strength to strength. There is the African Community of Practice on Natural Capital Accounting, which I think many member states are part of. And we encourage you to join the community of practice to share lessons and share experiences going forward. So thank you so much. And thank you again for the opportunity to make the case for natural capital in Africa and in the world as well. So thank you.
Okay, I would also thank, but I also apologize for being lost at the beginning of my presentation. And thanks, Sam, for just overcoming that challenge because of my technical challenges. But I got a lot of experience, and during the interaction, especially question and answers. It's helpful for African countries also to have such an opportunity and discussion, especially related to the natural capital accounting and valuations also, that is, because after accounting, we have to value and we have to just say something, how much the nature is contributing and how much we want to be financed and everything. So this is a good opportunity for, and also we are from different backgrounds. The second thing that I like was different people from different experiences, from different backgrounds, and we get a lot of experience. And finally, I would say that the efficiency, optimality, and the sustainability are crucial points in decision making, especially. So that we have to talk more about the optimality, the sustainability of the nature also, because when policies are designed, they should take into consideration the nature. And in order to do that, we have to be efficient and we have to be optimal in using during this generation and maybe the coming generations also. So the optimality is also required, and we have to consider all these issues. And I appreciate and thank you. That was a good opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you, Nerd. And that's a beautiful sentiment for us to end our session today. Thank you to all of our presenters. Thank you to all of our attendees. Thank you for devoting your time and expertise to protecting nature across Africa and beyond. Please join us for the next webinar in this series. It will be April 10th, 1600 EAT, the same time that this webinar started. So the exact same time on April 10th. Please register and we'll see you there. Thank you all so much for your time, and feel free to follow up with us with any additional questions. Thank you so much. Have a great day.